Chapter 11. As Anthony slowly regained consciousness, he felt disoriented and confused. A sharp pain in his face made him realize that he was not dreaming. He tried to open his eyes, but the darkness around him made it difficult to see. Gradually, he realized that he was lying under a palm-thatched roof. "I've been moved!" he exclaimed, startled by the sudden realization. The pain in his body reminded him of the deadly encounter with a rattlesnake. The memory made him shudder with fear. He tried to move his hand, but it felt numb and lifeless. Wet bandages on his face told him that someone had rescued him. He wondered if it was the Indians who had returned. As he lay there, he heard voices in the distance. Some were low and others deep and guttural. They sounded like Indian voices. Anthony realized that he had been saved from the brink of death. He whispered to himself, "I wasn't ready to die." The sun was setting and the palm leaves glowed with a golden light. Anthony noticed that there were olas and bags in the corner of the hut, which he had not seen before. An Indian blanket lay on the ground and a shadow crossed the sunlit gleams. Suddenly an Indian girl entered the hut. She had very dark skin and straight black hair that shone like midnight. Anthony watched her as she moved around the hut, silently going about her business. He wondered if she was the one who had saved him. As soon as Anthony caught sight of the girl staring at him with wide eyes, she let out a cry and ran away. A commotion of low voices could be heard outside the shack. Then a tall figure walked in. It was an Indian dressed in ragged clothes that belonged to a white man. He was old, with a dark bronze face that resembled a hard, wrinkled mask. "How?" he asked gruffly as he leaned over Anthony. He had piercing black eyes. "I'm all right, thank you," replied Anthony, trying to force a smile. He felt a sense of kindness in this old Indian. "White boy wants to dig for gold, but he got lost and has no food. Is that why he's sick and has a bellyache?" asked the Indian, placing a hand on Anthony's flat stomach. "Yes, you bet," replied Anthony. "Ha! Me Charlie Jim, a powerful medicine man. I'll fix you up. A snake bite won't hurt you. And if you're sick from not eating for a long time, I can help with that too," said Charlie Jim. "All right, Charlie Jim," replied Anthony. "Ha!" Apparently that exclamation meant good in Charlie Jim's language. He got up and backed away towards the opening, which was blocked by dark-skinned, black-haired Indians. Then he pointed at one of them. Anthony realized that he was indicating the girl who had come to him first. She seemed very shy. Anthony got the impression that she was the one who had saved him. "Charlie Jim, who found me and saved me from that rattlesnake?" asked Anthony. The old Indian understood Anthony well enough. He grinned and pointed at the young girl and pronounced a name that sounded like Oella to Anthony. "When? How long ago? How many days?" asked Anthony. Charlie Jim held up 3 fingers, then waved the other Indians away from the opening and left himself. Anthony was left with a tired and hazy mind, trying to make sense of the situation. He had no strength left, and the brief conversation with its excitement and exercise of voice brought him close to unconsciousness. He was surrounded by dim shadows of ideas and thoughts. When that condition passed, he woke up to a dull, throbbing headache. As he lay there, Anthony felt like an empty shell with his sides glued together. The sun's rays disappeared, and the evening shadows surrounded him. He caught a whiff of fragrant wood smoke and an unfamiliar scent that made his mouth water and his skin tingle. Suddenly, in the dim light, an Indian entered and knelt beside him. Anthony recognized the face of the girl, Oella. She draped a blanket over him and lifted his head carefully, positioning herself to provide support. The movement caused Anthony to feel dizzy and his vision to blur. Oella offered him something warm and wet on a stick or spoon, trying to feed him. Swallowing was painful, and Anthony found himself resisting the girl's efforts, even though he knew she was only trying to help. The food had no taste, but the heat and wetness felt good. As hunger returned, Anthony's mind was consumed by the sensation of movement in his stomach. Eventually, exhaustion overtook him and he fell asleep. The next day, hunger returned with a vengeance, making Anthony feel like he didn't want to live. The hours dragged on endlessly. But the following day was better, and with time Anthony started to feel like he was on the mend. The Indians who had taken care of him were part of the Coahuila tribe. Charlie Jim, who appeared to be a friendly chief, wandered from place to place, always on the move. Anthony had heard from a friend that Dismukes and him had found gold up the canyon. Charlie Jim had a family consisting of squaws, young men, 2 girls, and a bunch of wild children. Oella was one of the girls and the younger of the 2. Charlie Jim told Anthony that the head of the canyon had mesquite trees that the Indians ate from, as well as willows and arrowweeds for their granaries. The women of the family turned the mesquite beans into meal or flour. The remote canyon had good grass and water, which is why Charlie Jim frequented it. Despite having good horses, burros, and pack outfits, Charlie Jim did not seem to be a poor Indian. Anthony was weak and dependent on Oella's care. Even after he became strong enough to care for himself, Oella continued to care for him out of habit. She took great delight in serving him and was shy and reserved. Her large, black, inscrutable eyes were attractive to look at. As Anthony went about his business, Oella would watch him intently, sometimes without his knowledge. The light in her eyes pleased him, but also made him uneasy. It reminded him of what his old aunt had prophesied. "Anthony, my boy, women will always love you." Sadly, the prophecy had not come true, and he believed that his feelings for Oella were unrequited. However, he needed someone to talk to, or he would succumb to the desert's silence. So he began to teach Oella his language, and in turn learned hers. She was a quick learner and could articulate his words better than he could hers. Anthony was also determined to introduce some of the white man's ways into the Indian customs, which he thought were slovenly and dirty. He changed this in Oella's case, and she developed her own vanities through contact with him. One day, when summer was fading and Anthony was slowly recovering from his illness, the old Indian chief, Charlie Jim, asked him if he would be leaving soon. Anthony replied that he wanted to stay, and Charlie Jim nodded in understanding. He suggested that Anthony work with the Indians and hunt meat for them. He even offered to take his money and send it to the freighting post for supplies. Anthony agreed and gave him the money. Charlie Jim made a promise not to reveal Anthony's presence to any white men. Anthony was grateful and shook his hand in appreciation. The 2 Indian boys who had ridden to the freighting post on the river took 2 weeks to return to their camp. To celebrate their return, Anthony proposed a feast and offered to cook the bacon and bake the bread. Oella, who was usually shy, sat next to Anthony, enjoying her meal heartily. Anthony managed to persuade the wild, half-naked Indian children to come to him by offering them sweets. The center of attention at the camp was a brand-new Winchester .44 rifle. When Anthony took it out to practice, the whole family gathered around to watch with keen interest. Only the little children were scared of the loud noise of the rifle, but they soon got used to it. Oella was the only one who showed pride in Anthony's good shots, while the others were simply amazed. The days passed by in simplicity, and Anthony's strength returned with each passing day. Flour and bacon helped him regain his lost weight, and he enjoyed eating rice and dried fruits so much that he was afraid he would have to order more soon. He remembered the advice of Dismukes about the value of his money. The hot summer was replaced by the early autumn days, and Anthony started hunting with Charlie Jim. They crawled through sage to reach a low ridge from where the chief could spot game. Anthony could only see a beautiful but monotonous landscape with large tufts of sage and cacti scattered here and there. The Indian snatched Anthony's sombrero and 2 scarfs, one red and one blue, and wrapped them around the hat. He then hoisted the hat on a stick and gazed intently at the slope. Anthony joined him, feeling a mix of curiosity, excitement, and anticipation. Suddenly, Charlie Jim grunted, grabbed Anthony's arm, and pointed down the slope. Anthony squinted and saw gray spots moving in the distance. It took a while for them to get closer, and Anthony strained his eyes to identify them. "Antelope, by Jiminy!" Anthony exclaimed in excitement. "You bet! Heap Jiminy!" Charlie Jim responded. Anthony marveled at the sleek, tawny gray creatures with their fine heads, long ears, and white rumps. They looked like deer, but faster and wilder. The leader strode boldly forward, while some of the others hesitated, trotted back and forth, then followed. Anthony's finger itched to shoot them with his gun, but he felt a pang of guilt and wondered why he had to eat meat. The Indian beside him seemed more in tune with nature and its demands. Anthony's nerves got the better of him, and he shook uncontrollably. Charlie Jim whispered, "Heap soon," and slackened his grip on Anthony's arm. Anthony forced himself to calm down and took aim. As the leader of the antelope herd approached within 50 feet, followed closely by several others, the Indian let out a whistle. In an instant the animals froze in place like statues. Anthony took aim and fired, hitting both the leader and one of the others. The remaining antelope quickly darted away, their white rumps flashing in the distance. Anthony couldn't help but admire their incredible speed. "Ha!" exclaimed the chief in admiration. "White man shoot 2 bucks with 1 shot. His eye is like an eagle." This lucky shot earned Anthony the nickname Eagle from the Indian chief and marked the beginning of his education on the desert. He was fortunate to have such a skilled teacher in the Coahuila chief, who had been born and raised on the desert. With the senses of a mountain sheep, deer, and wolf combined, the chief was an expert hunter and had a deep love for stalking game. Through the chief's teachings, Anthony began to see the desert in a whole new light. He learned about the abundance of life that existed there, as well as the ferocity and survival skills of the animals that called it home. He discovered that antelope could survive for long periods without water, thanks to their great speed and ability to see in any direction with their prominent eyes. Their gray coloring also helped them blend in with the sage plains and avoid predators like wolves and cats. Anthony's education was slow and hard-earned, but he was eager to absorb all the knowledge he could. With the Indian chief as his guide, he learned to see the desert through new eyes and appreciate its wonders in a whole new way. He discovered that the lizard was a master of disguise, able to blend in with the rocks it lounged upon, and could scurry across the sand faster than the eye could follow. The gray desert wolf was a true king of the mountains, but would venture down to the flats to chase and kill its prey with deadly speed and strength. The coyote was a scavenger, feeding on anything it could find, from carrion to mesquite beans, and was a sly and cowardly creature unlike the brave and fearless wolf. The antelope and jackrabbit were able to survive without water, and the latter had developed its ears and legs to become a master of evasion. The cottontail rabbit lived in the thicket and had a remarkable ability to reproduce, ensuring its survival. Anthony also learned about the desert ants, kangaroo rats, trade rats, horned toads, lizards, snakes, spiders, bees, and wasps, and how each had adapted perfectly to their environment. Nature was merciless to the individual, but fiercely devoted to the survival of the species. The same fierce spirit was evident in the plants that thrived in the harsh desert environment. The plants of the desert had a cunning way of outsmarting the beasts with their thorns, poisoned sap, leafless branches, deep roots, and water-storing organs. It was a mystery to humans how a cactus could develop a structure that was less exposed to heat than a tree's leaves. The harsh desert days were marked by ruddy sunrises, glaring noons, and golden sunsets. Anthony became accustomed to the simple yet violent life on the desert. Hunting bighorn sheep with an Indian chief was an incredible experience, but it was the glory of the mountain heights that truly captivated Anthony. He had always dreamed of climbing high places, both physically and spiritually. Though his aspirations for the latter were lost, he found fulfillment in conquering the former. It was on top of the Chocolate Range where he first felt his soul change. From that vantage point, he could see far beyond the valleys and ranges to the Rio Colorado, where he glimpsed Picacho in the distance. The sight of that mountain brought back memories and a sense of eternal remorse that would never fade for the rest of his life. As he stood on the heights, the wind blew sweet and strong against his face, and the dark blue sky loomed over him. The desert stretched out before him, vast and lonely, the abode of silence. It was there that Anthony began to repent, promising dismukes and vowing to change his ways. Months passed, and winter came to the peaks of San Jacinto and San Gorgonio, while the Chocolate and Chuckwalla ranges remained snow-free. Anthony loved the cold, pure wind of the heights, untainted by dust or life. He grew to have the stride of a mountaineer, spending his days climbing the bare ridges and through high ravines where strange pale flowers bloomed. One day the old Indian chief allowed Anthony to hunt alone, calling him Eagle with sorrow for his years and pride in his white friend's youth. From then on, Anthony would venture out in the sweet, cool dawn to climb the slopes, sure-footed as a goat. He would face the east, watching the sunrise-crowned glory of old Picacho, his gaze filled with the meaning of a prayer, yet like a blade in his heart. As he gazed out at the vast landscape, memories flooded Anthony's mind. He thought of his childhood home, his loving family, and the days of carefree play. But his thoughts soon turned to his journey west, his mistakes and his downfall. Standing alone on the mountain peaks, he forced himself to relive these painful memories. He spent hours consumed by his guilt, punishing himself with bitter thoughts and refusing to forget his past mistakes. But there were also moments of freedom and excitement. Anthony was young and full of life, and he reveled in the thrill of climbing the rocky heights. The Indians had given him the name Eagle, and he was proud to watch these magnificent creatures soar through the sky. Whether it was the majestic blue condors, the fierce vultures, or the powerful eagles, Anthony was captivated by their beauty and grace. There were times when he even longed to live the life of an eagle himself, soaring high above the world with a mate by his side. As he stood on the mountain peaks, he was once again visited by a strange sensation that had first arisen in the desert. Dismukes had warned him of the lure of the desert and the infinite truth that lay beyond it. But for now, Anthony was content to live in the moment, enjoying the freedom and exhilaration of the mountain peaks. "Gotcha now!" exclaimed Anthony as he braced himself against the cold winds. Hunting mountain sheep on the steep slopes was no easy feat. The terrain was treacherous, with sharp ridges, exposed slopes, and loose rocks. The sheep's eyes were like telescopes, giving them the sharpest vision of all wild animals. Their eyes protruded from their heads like half a pear, allowing them to see in almost every direction. Unlike some hunters who used bright colors to lure the curious animals, Anthony relied on his own skills and endurance to outsmart them. For Anthony, hunting was more than just a game. He welcomed the exhaustion, pain, and danger as opportunities to learn and improve his skills. He saw failure as a chance to try again and do better. Climbing up the mountain, crawling over sharp rocks, and waiting for hours were all part of the challenge. And when he finally caught a ram, the real work began. Carrying the heavy animal down the mountain was even harder than working in the gold mill at Picacho. He had to hold the rifle in one hand and the sheep in the other, navigating the slippery ledges, sliding banks, and cracked lava. Anthony didn't do all this for fun or fame. He wanted to earn the respect of the Indians who called him Eagle. They looked up to him as a white man who had proven himself worthy of their admiration. And for Anthony, that was the ultimate reward. He taught them skills that would improve their lives, the work of white men that would better their existence. His mastery of some of their own achievements impressed them even more. The days turned into months, and before they knew it, summer arrived once again. The vast oval bowl of desert glowed in the rosy sunrise, glared in the white noon hours, and burned at sunset. The heat veils moved in rippling clouds over the Salton Sink, and the Superstition Mountain's pale, wavering line changed mysteriously with each day. The fog clouds from the Pacific rolled over to lodge against the fringed peaks. Time did not mean anything to the desert, although it worked patiently and ceaselessly in its infinite details. The desert might have worked for eternity. Its moments were but the months that were growing into years of Anthony's life. San Jacinto and San Gorgonio appeared before him once again, crowned with snow that gleamed so white against the blue. One day, Charlie Jim showed Anthony a hole in the gravel and sand of a gully where Dismucus had dug out a pocket of gold. Anthony gathered that the Indian had brought Dismukes there. "White man gold mad," said the chief. "No happy little gold. Want dig all heap hog damn fool." Charlie Jim characterized Dismukes. Evidently there had been some just cause, which he did not explain, for his bringing Dismukes into this hidden canyon. And there was also some significance in his bringing Anthony there. Charlie Jim and his family had saved and succored Anthony, and there had been many rewards. "Indian show Eagle heap gold," said Charlie Jim, and led him to another gully opening down into the canyon. In the dry sand and gravel of this wash, Anthony found gold. The discovery gave him a wonderful thrill, but it did not drive him mad. Anthony could sense the dark, impassive face of his guide, and he knew that there was something of the Indian's contempt for a white man's frenzy over gold. The Coahuila chief spoke in his native language, stating that the Indian repaid both friends and enemies with good or evil. He believed that there were white men who could be trusted with the secrets of the desert. One day the chief decided to embark on a journey with his family and Anthony, seeking a change of scenery and work. Anthony enjoyed the lifestyle as he knew that Charlie Jim did not frequent the trails of white men. Time flew by quickly as they explored new and unfamiliar parts of the desert. Anthony kept track of time by observing the changes in the landscape, such as the white snow on the peaks and the green and gold cottonwoods turning gray. Returning to the oasis in the canyon of the Chocolate Range felt like coming home to Anthony. He even loved the place where he had been tortured. Every stone and tree felt like old friends, welcoming him back. The sandy-floored Isle of Palms and the flat rock where he had sat for a whole day in pain were all too familiar to him. He had walked through the isle for hours on end, possessed by the demon of remorse. Most of all, he loved the endless expanse of the gray desert, which was both lonely and melancholy. The lofty, barren heights of rock welcomed him with sweet, cold winds in his face whenever he scaled them like an Indian climbing to meet his spirits. The sight of the winding gleam of the Rio Colorado thrilled him, while the sight of Picacho brought back a keen and new pang of pain. Nothing had changed. Had he expected it to? In the distance, the towering peak of Picacho loomed, casting a lilac hue over the desert landscape. It was a commanding presence, unchanging and eternal, much like the sin that Anthony had committed in its shadow. It was there that his brother Carl lay buried, and the thought of it haunted him. "I'll go back someday," he whispered, the idea taking root in his mind. Picacho had been the birthplace of his destiny, the place where he had found purpose and meaning. But it had also been the site of his downfall, the place where he had met Amy. She had been a frail and dusky-eyed girl, an instrument of his doom. He had forgiven her long ago, but the memory of her still hurt. She had spoken lightly of things that he held sacred, and he could not forget it. Every sight of a green Palo Verde tree brought a pang to his heart. At sunset, the old chief approached Anthony, somber and grave. He spoke in the language of his people. "White man, you are of the brood of the eagle. Your heart is the heart of an Indian. Take my daughter Owella as your wife." Anthony had feared this moment, and now it had come. He knew he could not accept the chief's offer. "No, chief, the white man cannot marry Owella. He has blood on his hands, a price on his head. Someday he might have to hang for his crime. He cannot be dishonest with the Indian girl who saved him." The chief's face remained inscrutable, but he made a slow, impressive gesture, waving his hand to indicate great distance and time. It was clear that Anthony must go. He dropped his head, knowing that the decree was just and irrevocable. As he packed for a long journey, the sun began to set on the Indian encampment. Anthony knew that Owella had been informed of his departure as he faced her in the shadow of the palms. This was not the same shy and peculiar Indian maiden he had met before. Instead, she appeared to be a woman with a full bosom and a strong, dark face. Her piercing eyes searched his soul as he realized how blind he had been to her womanly love. His heart began to beat hard and fast. "Owella, your father has sent me away," Anthony said. "I am an outcast and a hunted man. If I made you my wife, it might bring shame and sorrow to you." But Owella was not afraid. "Stay," she said. "We will hide in the canyons." Anthony shook his head. "No, I have sinned. I have blood on my hands, but Owella, I am not dishonorable. I will not cheat you." "Take me," she cried in a soft, passionate voice that shook Anthony's heart. She was willing to share his wanderings. "Goodbye, Owella," he said, his voice husky. And with that he strode out into the lonely and melancholy desert night, driving his burro ahead of him. Chapter 12. Anthony and Dismukes met for the second time in Tecopa, a mining camp nestled in the Mojave Desert. The valley was a stunning sight, with green and gray plants marking the creek's path and sandy benches stretching out to the dark rocky slopes. These slopes resembled lava and extended far into the bleak ranges. It was March, the most vibrant season in the Mojave, when Anthony arrived at Tecopa. He stopped on a grassy bench at the camp's outskirts, where a small spring emerged and trickled down to the creek. Desert men celebrated this spring's drinking water and went out of their way to drink from it. While attending to his camp tasks, Anthony heard the telltale ears of his burros, signaling the approach of someone. He looked up to see a familiar figure making his way towards him. Anthony rubbed his eyes in disbelief. Was that the same figure he remembered so vividly? The man approaching him was squat, huge, and grotesque. It was Dismukes. He wore a motley, patched garb, an old slouch hat, and yellow boots covered in clay and alkali, just as he had on the day Anthony had first laid eyes on him. Dismukes drove his burros up to the edge of the bench, clearly intending to camp nearby. But when he spotted Anthony, he hesitated and gruffly called to his burros, turning away. "Hello, Dismukes," called Anthony. "Plenty of room to camp here." The prospector stopped and slowly turned back. "You know me?" he asked gruffly as he approached. "Yes, I know you, Dismukes," replied Anthony, offering his hand. "You've got the best of me." Dismukes shook Anthony's hand, but he seemed not to recognize Anthony. His great ox eyes, rolling and dark, looked Anthony over with a strange, curious glance. "Look close. See if you can recognize a man you befriended once," Anthony said. The moment was filled with both pain and gladness. This was the man who had saved him and inspired him to conquer the desert. Dismukes was perplexed and a little ashamed. His piercing gaze was that of someone who had befriended many men and couldn't remember them all. "Stranger, I give it up. I don't know you." "Wansfell," said Anthony, his voice full. Dismukes stared, his expression changing, but not with recognition. "Wansfell, Wansfell," he exclaimed. "I know that name. Hell yes, I've heard of you all over the Mojave. I'm sure glad to meet you." "I don't think we've met before," Anthony said, the sadness of the moment hitting him hard. Dismukes failed to recognize him, confirming that Anthony had truly transformed into Wansfell after years in the desert. For the first time in a long time, he felt safe. No one would recognize him or catch him for his past crimes. "Hey, Dismukes, how close are you to getting that 500 grand?" Anthony asked, a small smile on his face as he enjoyed baffling the old prospector. "By God, how'd you know about that?" Dismukes exclaimed, bewildered. "You told me," Anthony replied casually. "Dang, Wansfell, are you psychic or am I drunk?" Dismukes demanded, still trying to make sense of the situation. "I was just thinking about that 500 grand, but I haven't told anyone except for a boy who's long gone." "What about your burro Ginny, the one that used to steal from your pack?" Anthony asked slowly. "Ginny, Ginny," Dismukes exclaimed, his eyes widening as he remembered something important. "I never forgot about her. I gave her to a boy who was starving on the desert. She came back to me, tracked me down in Yuma. And you, how do you know Ginny? Who are you?" "Dismukes, I was that boy you saved under the chocolates, 90 miles from Yuma. Ginny found me wandering in circles, mad with thirst. You saved me, gave me Ginny and a pack, taught me how to survive in the desert, and sent me to the Indians. I am that boy, and now I am Wansfell," Anthony said, his voice heavy with emotion. Dismukes stared at him for a moment, straining to see the truth in his eyes, and then, in a moment of recognition, the prospector seemed to expand with joy and relief. "Oh, my God, I recognize you!" exclaimed the man, grabbing Anthony with excitement that stemmed from a deep-rooted faith in fate. "I thought you died in the desert. When Ginny returned, I was certain of it. But you're alive. You were that boy, tall as a mescal plant with pained eyes. I never forgot. And now you're Wansfell." "Yes, my friend, life is unpredictable in the desert," responded Anthony. "Now let's unpack your burros and make camp here. We'll eat and catch up." As they completed their simple tasks, a rare sunset illuminated the Mojave. Clouds hung over the mountain tops, painted in deeper colors as the sun set. The dark purples had a silver edge, and the fluffy whites transformed into shades of pink and rose. Golden rays shot up from behind the red-hazed peaks, casting a beautiful and transparent light over the valley. The shadow of Tecapa was as blue as the sea. While they ate their meager meal, the men conversed, breaking the usual silence of the desert. They showed an unconscious respect for each other, with Wansfell viewing Dismukes as his savior and mentor who inspired him to overcome the hardships of life. Dismukes saw in Wansfell the embodiment of his philosophy, the divine spirit of man triumphing over the primal beasts of the desert, with self-preservation and ferocity. "Wansfell, have you been keeping track of time?" asked Dismukes thoughtfully, producing a black stumpy pipe that Anthony remembered. "No, days and weeks blend into years. That's all I can keep track of," replied Anthony. "I never could. What is time in the desert? Nothing. But it does fly, that's for sure. It must be years since we first met down in the Colorado. Let me think." "I've thought of it many a time, Wansfell," said Dismukes, his grizzled face lighting up at the thought. "But you know me. I couldn't leave until I found the mother lode. It's what I came out here for, and I won't leave until I get it." Wansfell shook his head in disbelief. "You've been at it for 8 years, Dismukes. What makes you think you'll find it now?" Dismukes shrugged. "I don't know. Call it a hunch, but I can feel it, Wansfell. It's out there somewhere, just waiting for me to find it." Wansfell sighed. His friend was a stubborn man, and he knew there was no changing his mind. "Well, if that's what you want, then I won't try to stop you. Just promise me one thing, Dismukes." "What's that?" "Promise me that if you do find it, you'll take the money and leave this place. Start a new life somewhere else. You've earned it, my friend." Dismukes nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the distant mountains. "I promise, Wansfell. If I find it, I'll take the money and leave this place. But until then, I'm staying put." And with that, the two friends fell silent, lost in their own thoughts and dreams of gold. For in the desert, where life was hard and the future uncertain, dreams were all they had to keep them going. In the scorching heat and crushing loneliness of the desert, Dismukes had often been tempted by the promise of gold, but he knew better than to give in. "It's the same to me now as if I had no money at all," he said. Anthony warned him to be careful, reminding him that the pursuit of gold could be all-consuming. "It's the gaining of gold, not what it might bring, that drives you," he cautioned. Dismukes pondered his friend's words. "Have you learned the curse, or it may be the blessing of the desert, what makes us wanderers of the wastelands?" he asked. "No, I have not," replied Anthony. "But it's a great thing, Dismukes, and it is linked to the very beginnings of us. Someday I'll know." As they sat in silence, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. The sounds of Tecopa waking up to the night's revelry drifted across the creek. Curious about how Anthony had ended up in this desolate place, Dismukes asked him. Anthony explained that Tecopa was just a waterhole for him, but Dismukes admitted that he had found gold in the nearby Kingston Range. His plan was to continue on to the Funeral Mountains, which were known to be rich in minerals but also a treacherous and unforgiving place for a prospector. "The other side of the Funerals is Death Valley," he added ominously. As they sat there, surrounded by the vast and unforgiving desert, both men knew that their pursuit of gold could lead them to great riches or to their ultimate demise. That gaping wound in the summer is a blasting, roaring hell. I've crossed it every month of the year. Only madmen ever attempt to cross Death Valley in July in the middle of the day. I've seen the mercury rise to 140 degrees. I've seen it 125 at midnight. And when those furnace winds blow down the valley at night, sleep or rest is impossible. You just gasp for life. But strange to say, the fascination of the desert is stronger in Death Valley than at any other place. "Yes, I can appreciate that," replied Anthony thoughtfully. "It must be the sublimity of death and desolation, the terrible loneliness and awfulness of the naked earth. I am going there." "So I reckoned. And see here, Wansfell, I'll get out my pencil and draw you a little map of the valley, showing my trails and water holes. I know that country better than any other white man. It's a mineral country. The lower slope of the Funerals is all clay, borax, soda, alkali, salt, niter, and when the weather's hot and that stuff blows on the hot winds, my God, it's a horror. But you'll want to go through it all and you'll go back again. Where do you advise me to go in?" "Well, I'd follow the Amargosa. It's bad water, but better than none. Go across and up into the Panamints and come back across again by Furnace Creek. I'll make you a little map. There's more bad water than good, and some of it's arsenic. I found the skeletons of 6 men near an arsenic waterhole. Reckon they'd come on this water when bad off for thirst and didn't know enough to test it. And they drank their fill and died in their tracks. They had gold, too. But I never could find out anything about these men. No one ever heard of them, and I was the only man who knew of the tragedy. Well, it's not uncommon for me to come across dead bodies, but I've never seen so many before. Wansfell, have you seen your fair share of dried-up corpses, yellow as leather, or bleached bones with grinning skulls, white in the sun?" "Yeah, I've buried more than one poor soul," replied Anthony. "But is it really necessary to bury them? I leave them as a warning to other travelers. Only a crazy person would drink from a waterhole where there's a skeleton nearby. But let's get back to your journey to Death Valley. I suggest taking the Amargosa. It's a winding stream, but safe, with firewood and some grass. Once you cross the valley, you'll come across prospectors, miners, and wanderers at the water holes. And you might even run into some claim jumpers and robbers that live in the Panamints. From what I've heard about you, Wansfell, I bet meeting them would be bad news for them and good fortune for honest miners. Am I right?" "Dismukes, I don't run from men like that," replied Anthony, his tone grim. I figured as much," said Dismukes just as grimly. "Last time I was over there it was September and hotter than hell. I stumbled upon two strange folks living in a canyon I'd never prospected before. There was no sign of any other prospectors ever being there. A man and a woman living in a shack they built right under the roughest slope of weathered rock I've ever seen. It was a case of suicide, plain and simple. I tried to tell them, but every hour you could hear the crack of a rolling boulder or the slip of an avalanche, making me uneasy and wanting to get out of there. The woman was absolutely terrified of her husband, who was a despicable creature that I can only describe as a mixture of a skunk and a wolf. I couldn't do anything to help the poor woman, and I couldn't gather much more information than what I'm telling you now. It's not much, but I can tell you that she was not an ordinary woman. She had been beautiful once, but her face was now the saddest I had ever seen. I had two feelings about her. One was that she would not be on this earth much longer, and the other was that her husband hated her with a deep, intense passion. As I wander around this desert, I come across strange people and situations, but this experience was the most unsettling of them all. Wansfell, I want you to go and see that couple. I believe they'll still be there if they're still alive." He chose a hidden spot and had Shoshone Indians bring his supplies from ranches on the other side of the Panamints. It's a terrible situation for that poor woman, and her face has haunted me ever since. I want you to go there." "I'll go, but why do you say that, Dismukes?" asked Anthony curiously. "Well, you should know what your name means to those who live in the desert," replied Dismukes, looking down at the campfire and pushing a half-burnt piece of wood forward. "No, I've never heard," said Anthony. "I've mostly lived alone. Of course, I've had to go to freight posts and camps, and I've worked in gold mines. I've even led wagon trains across the Mojave. Naturally, I've been around men, but I've never heard that my name meant anything. Wansfell. I remember now that you called yourself Wansfell. I've heard that name before. Some of your adventures have become campfire stories. Look, Wansfell, I hope you won't take offense at me." "No offense taken, friend Dismukes," replied Anthony, feeling strangely affected. This news forced him to think of himself as a man somehow related to and responsible for his fellow humans. He had traveled back and forth across the desert trails, encountering countless adventures along the way. He had embraced them all with the resilience the desert had instilled in him before moving on down the solitary paths, lost in his own thoughts. The years had passed by as quickly as the blowing sand. He had been a young boy with a heavy burden of guilt and shame, but now he was a grown man who still carried the weight of his past, his temples gray with age. It was heartening to hear his name spoken with admiration and reverence by strangers. He had helped many wanderers, just as Dismukes had helped him. He had dealt with cruel men who crossed his path with the same desert violence that he had faced. He had undoubtedly performed countless acts of kindness in a barren world where even the smallest deeds were cherished. However, the name Wansfell meant nothing to him. The reputation that Dismukes had hinted at filled him with both wonder and sadness. It was a reminder of the talents he had been given and what he had done with them. "Wansfell, you're something like the man I could have been," Dismukes said hesitantly. "Oh no, Dismukes," Anthony replied. "You're a prospector, honest and hard-working, and now you're wealthy, ready to enjoy the fruits of your labor. Your life has a great purpose. But I'm just a wanderer of the wasteland." "Aye, and that's where your greatness lies," the prospector exclaimed, his eyes widening. "I'm a selfish pig digging in the dirt for gold. My obsession has blinded me to people who need help. Riches are just dreams. But you, Wansfell, out there in the loneliness and silence of the wastelands, you've found God. I knew you would. I've met other men who have." No, Anthony replied, shaking his head. "You're mistaken. I don't think I've found God. Not yet. I have no religion, no faith. The desert is a harsh place, unforgiving and uncaring. It is just one of nature's playgrounds where man has no place." Despite all this, Dismukes was convinced that Anthony had found God. Anthony disagreed, saying that he hadn't found any hope in the desert. Dismukes calmly replied that Anthony had found God, but just didn't realize it yet. He took out his pipe and began to refill it. Anthony didn't mean to bring up such heavy topics. He usually just asked prospectors if they had found any gold lately. but he enjoyed talking to Dismukes because he made his mind work. The desert was a place where a man had to fight with his intelligence, or he would become less than a man. Dismukes agreed, saying that sometimes his mind was crowded with a million thoughts all clamoring to be set free. Anthony agreed, saying that he talked to his burrows and to himself just to hear the sound of his voice. Dismukes was deeply moved by this and nodded his shaggy head. Anthony asked if Dismukes had ever tried to find gold in the desert. Dismukes replied that he had been there first after the strike, but water was all that ever drew him. He would starve before he would dig for gold among a pack of beasts. He may be a desert wolf, but he was a lone one. Anthony compared the other men he met to beasts or creatures of the desert. Dismukes agreed, saying that the desert stamped a man. He joked that Anthony had the look of a desert eagle and that he wasn't flattering either of them. As I prowled through the desert, hungry and fierce like a gray wolf, I couldn't help but notice the long, lean-headed eagle above me, its eyes fixed on its prey as if ready to strike at any moment. It was a strange and wondrous sight, one that could only be found in the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the desert. Living on the desert was not easy for any creature, and yet they all managed to survive. Each one was a perfect machine for destruction, swift and fierce in their pursuit of prey. The way the desert developed its inhabitants was a mystery to me. Even the human creatures grew fiercer than animals, perhaps because nature never intended for us to live in such a place. Despite this, there were those who had lived in the desert for hundreds of years, like the handful of Indians Anthony mentioned. But what were a few years compared to the millions of years the desert had existed in its current state? Nothing at all. I knew that someday men would come to the desert, building dams and storage places for water, turning the Colorado River over the desert to make it green and rich. They would build towns and cities, cross the desert with railroads, and grow rich and proud. But they would never truly conquer the desert, for only those who had lived with it for much of their lives could ever truly know its secrets. As time passes, men will age, and their sons and grandsons will come after them. Even if 100 or 1,000 years go by, mankind will still have control over the land. However, this is only a small amount of time when compared to the endless sands of eternity. The desert's progress may be delayed for just a little while, but the desert works tirelessly and with infinite patience. The sun beats down, the frost cracks, the avalanche rolls, the rain erodes. Over time, the Earth's crust rises into mountains, and eventually, atom by atom, the mountains erode into the sands of the desert. The winds blow ceaselessly, and nothing can stand against the desert winds. They move the sand, sift it, and bury whatever lies in their path. Men will die, and the places that once knew them will know them no more. The desert will reclaim its own, as God intended. Anthony asked if God and nature were the same to Dismukes, who replied that they were. Sleeping on the sand for 20 years with the stars above him had taught him that. Anthony, however, could not reconcile nature and God. To him, nature was cruel and hopeless, while God represented immortality. Dismukes believed that some men had divinity within them, but not all or many, so how could that divinity be God? He also believed that if Anthony did not have a child, he would not have immortality. Anthony asked about his soul, but Dismukes did not have an answer. Despite his deep exploration, he could not find his soul, and therefore could not find God. So, Wansfell, Anthony shook his head in response to Dismukes' question, I'm no closer to finding God in this desert than you are. But I do have a different view on life and death. I've had to fight to survive out here, but the hardest battle has been to keep my mind sharp. Nature wields a powerful weapon, and I've had plenty of time to study the ferocity and purpose of this land. It's no wonder the desert leaves its mark on a man. Aye, and a woman, too, Dismukes added. There's a she-devil running a place in Tecapa, goes by the name Mojave Joe. Have you seen her? No, but I've heard of her, Anthony replied. I met the wife of a miner in Needles who told me about her husband being killed here in Tecapa. I've never heard of Clark, but I don't doubt the story. Miners being killed and robbed is all too common. There's a gang over in the Panamints that lives off of them. I'm curious to see Mojave Joe, Anthony said. Well, speaking of one-eyed harridans, it reminds me of a man I met on my last trip across the Salton Flats down on the Colorado. I met him at Walter's, a post on the stage line. He only had one eye with a terrible scar where his right eye used to be. He was one of those Texans looking for a man. There's talk of a railroad opening up that part of the desert, and this fellow was asking me about water holes. If anyone finds water in that country, they'll be as rich as if they struck gold. It's likely to happen, too. This man had an awful face, and someone said he used to be a sheriff in Texas and later at Ehrenberg. He was hell on hanging men. Of course, I never asked him how he lost his eye, but he spoke of it more than once. The man had been driven insane by his deformity. Anthony met people like that, crazy from something. This man was always looking for the person who had knocked out his eye. He wanted to kill him. "Do you remember his name?" Anthony asked, his voice thick with emotion. It felt like the past had just happened. "I never was good at remembering names," replied Dismukes, scratching his head. "Let me think. Yes, he called himself Collis Haw. That's it, Collishaw. A hard name to remember, but as a person he was easy to remember. Well, friend Wansfell, I've talked enough for a while. I'm going to bed." Anthony sat by the fire thinking over what he had just heard while Dismukes prepared for bed. He unrolled his pack, spread out a ragged canvas, folded a blanket on top of it, and arranged another blanket to pull over himself, along with the end of the canvas. He used an old coat as a pillow. The only thing he did to undress was take off his hat. Then he lay down, stretching his huge body and pulling the coverlets over himself with slow, labored movements. He let out a long sigh from his cavernous chest. His big, dark, staring eyes looked up at the brightening stars, then closed. Anthony felt tempted to pack up and move to a quiet, lonely place in the desert where he could think without interruption. His memory had been faithful and keen, but he had long stopped thinking about Collishaw, the relentless sheriff and Carl's ally. How strange and painful it was to remember him now. It had been Anthony's gun that had hit Collishaw's face and destroyed an eye, causing him to become horribly disfigured. The Texan, with his fatalistic nature, was always searching for the man who had ruined his eyesight. This was just one reason for his thirst for revenge. Collishaw had sworn to hang Anthony, yelling in his cold, passionate voice, "You'll swing for this." Anthony relived the agony of the past, feeling the bitter mockery and vain hope of forgetfulness. The vast desert seemed smaller now as a relentless and bloodthirsty Texan hunted him. Death stalked him, and the hatred of men was beyond his understanding. Some men would sacrifice everything, including work, fame, health, love, home, and life itself, just to kill a rival or enemy. Collishaw had hated him and loved Carl, and had a strange instinct to kill men. This passion grew by what it fed on, a morbid mental twist that drove him to rid himself of the ghost of his last victim by killing a new one. There was also a certain leaning towards the notorious. Anthony knew that they would meet someday, and he would tell Collishaw who he was and kill him. This fierce whisper was the desert spirit in Anthony, and he could not help it any more than he could help breathing. Nature in the desert did not teach forgiveness or waiting until struck. Survival on the desert required more instinct than intelligence or humanity. To thrive, a man had to absorb the tenacity of the mesquite roots, the ferocity of the wildcat, and the cruelty of the hawk. It was a law of the land that demanded a man to be violent before violence was inflicted upon him. Anthony pondered this as he shook his head in doubt. He knew that blessings were not his to have. Duty to himself was his only concern. He wrapped himself in his blankets, but sleep evaded him. He wasn't tired despite walking for miles. His strength seemed endless. He lay awake, listening to the quiet of the desert, only broken by the deep breathing of his companion and the howl of the coyotes. A sadness weighed on him. Meeting Dismukes had brought a sense of tranquility, but now he regretted it. The encounter had torn a veil, revealing the unchanging nature of his crime and the weight of his sin. Time had softened his remorse, but Dismukes had brought back the specter of his past. 8 years had gone by since Anthony had last seen his brother Carl, but it felt like only 8 days. The stars above were bright and cold, and the mountains that had once made him feel strong now seemed dark and foreboding. As he looked up at the deep blue sky and down at the black shadows, he saw a white face that appeared and disappeared, haunting him with its mournful and accusing presence. It was the face of Carl, his brother, and it reminded Anthony of the brand of Cain that had been burned into his brain. The old feelings of pain and sorrow returned to Anthony's heart, along with the tears and sleepless nights. He remembered the days when he had first arrived in the Colorado desert and had gazed out at the purple peak Picacho, which towered above his brother's grave. He had whispered to himself then that he would return one day, and now he felt as if he was being called back by some mysterious force. As the night wore on, Anthony looked over at Dismukes, a man who seemed as strange and strong as the wastelands he spoke so fondly of. He wondered if Dismukes truly loved gold, or if his passion was only a dream. Whatever the case may be, there was a shadow of tragedy on his ragged, dark face that made Anthony feel a sense of pity for him. As he watched Dismukes sleep, Anthony wondered what his own face would look like when he was no longer in control of his mind. Would he look like an eagle, as Dismukes had said? He had seen eagles in the desert, both alive and dead, and the comparison had been made before. He struggled to remember their appearance, but the mental pictures were unconvincing. The sharp gaze, as crystal clear as the desert air, with the ability to see far into the gray depths. The slender, elongated shape. The untamed stance of the head, full of bitterness, ruthlessness, and ferocity. The sense of isolation that these traits surely could not be compared to his own face. It was a strange coincidence that Dismukes had likened them to an eagle, the winged lightning bolt of the heights, the solitary bird that Anthony adored more than any other desert creature. Anthony's thoughts wandered until he eventually drifted off to sleep. Chapter 13. As soon as Anthony opened his eyes, he spotted Dismukes cooking breakfast over the fire. "I'm heading out today," the prospector declared. "What are your plans?" "I'll stick around Tecopa for as long as I can handle it," Anthony responded. That won't be too long unless you're planning on doing something similar to what you did at the Donner Placers in the Providence Mountains," Dismukes remarked. "What do you know about that?" Anthony inquired. "Not much, only heard about it," Dismukes admitted. "Wansfeld, do you ever pan for gold?" "Sometimes, if I come across it," Anthony answered. "But that doesn't happen often." "Have you worked before?" Dismukes asked, intrigued. "Yes, I've done a fair amount of work in mines, on the river in Needles, driving mule teams, and guiding wagon trains," Anthony explained. "But I never made much money doing any of it." "How do you manage to live, then?" Dismukes questioned. "Oh, I get by well enough to keep some meat on my bones," Anthony replied. "You have more than just meat on your bones, Wansfeld. You're the most well-built man I've ever seen in the desert. Most men shrivel up and disappear," Dismukes commented. "Would you let me lend you some money?" "Money? Is that why you're so curious?" Anthony asked. "Thanks, but I don't need any money. I had some when you found me in the chocolates. I used about $1,000 while living with the Coahuila Indians." "I've still got 9 grand, Anthony said. "You don't carry all that cash with you, do you?" Dismukes asked. "Where else would I keep it?" Anthony replied. "You're heading into dangerous territory, Wansfeld. These robbers might kill you," Dismukes warned. "Not if I see them first. Don't worry, I can handle myself," Anthony assured him. "Well, I've been robbed 3 times up here. My advice? Don't let anyone see you with that much money," Dismukes advised. "Did you fight back when you were robbed?" Anthony asked. "No chance. I was ambushed and had to surrender," Dismukes admitted. "You've heard a lot about me, haven't you?" Anthony said. "I heard you killed Baldy McHugh with your bare hands," Dismukes said, his eyes flashing. "I don't like to talk about it," Anthony said. "McHugh did me wrong. He stole my claims and threatened to kill me. He was a robber and a murderer," Dismukes said. "I took care of him," Anthony confirmed. Dismukes rubbed his hands together and his eyes widened with a fierce intensity. He seemed satisfied that Anthony had settled the score with McHugh. "Why did you kill him?" asked Dismukes. "I had to. He would have killed me," replied Wansfeld. Dismukes looked at him suspiciously. "Did you go looking for him with the intention to kill?" "No," Wansfeld shook his head. "A year before that I was in Goffs when I visited a dying woman in an old tent. She blamed McHugh for her condition and died shortly after. I buried her and kept an eye out for McHugh." Dismukes nodded. "I understand. It struck a chord with me when I heard about it. Fights and death are common out here, but the way you handled it was different. It's what I would have done myself. The desert magnifies everything, including life." "That's true," Wansfeld agreed. "But the desert is vast, and it can be months or even years before you meet another person. However, when you do, it's intense." Dismukes leaned in. "There's something wrong with a woman in a shack in Death Valley. The man keeping her there is either crazy or worse than a gorilla. I want you to handle him like you did McHugh." Wansfell considered it. "Draw me a map of your trails in Death Valley. I have a little book and pencil here." Dismukes eagerly pulled out his map and watched as Wansfell used his calloused fingers to mark the route. It was an odd sight, seeing a gold digger with such rough hands delicately holding a pencil. It took him a while to jot down a few lines, make some marks, and write some names in his small notebook. However, when he began talking about distance and direction, trails and springs, flat valleys and mountain ranges, he spoke with fluency and swiftness. He had a clear picture of the entire area in his mind, as if he were a great condor soaring above the barren wasteland that was his home. "I'll be heading down to the funerals soon," Dismukes announced. "Here's Furnace Creek, where it flows into Death Valley. Cross it and head up Furnace Creek until you hit the yellow clay hills on your right. It's a mess of hills, completely barren. I think there's gold. You'll find me somewhere." It was settled then that Anthony and Dismukes would meet at some vague place at some vague time. The desert had no boundaries. Time, distance, and location were all thought of in terms of how they suited desert dwellers. "Well, it's getting late," Dismukes said, looking up at the blazing sun. "I'll pack up and be on my way." While Dismukes went to herd his burros, Anthony took care of the camp chores. In no time, his companion returned with the burros trotting ahead of him. Seeing them, Anthony was reminded of the differences between prospectors. Dismukes was not sluggish, lazy, or careless. He had not experienced the strange deterioration that was so common among his peers. He did not belong to the type of prospector who spent the entire day tracking his burros so that he could start the next day. Anthony assisted him with packing. "Wansfell, may we meet again," Dismukes said as they shook hands. "All trails cross in the desert. I hope you strike it rich." "Someday, someday. Goodbye," Anthony replied, and with a vigorous pat, Dismukes set off with his burros. Anthony was left to his own devices. As Dismukes disappeared from view in the gray haze of the benches, Anthony spent a considerable amount of time observing a chuckwalla lizard perched on a rock. The reptile was long and slender with a greenish-bronze hue, and its skin was adorned with vibrant spots resembling jewels. Anthony found solace in observing the living creatures of the desert and listening to the tranquil silence that surrounded him. He realized that watching anything could bring a reward, whether it be an unusual occurrence in nature or a new thought. Eventually, Anthony made his way down to the creek bottom where the smelter was in operation. The area was in dire need of laborers, and he was offered a job. He replied that he would think about it, but he wouldn't sacrifice his freedom for the sake of the dusty mill, no matter how much gold it produced. The clangorous mills, scorching shafts, and dark caverns weighed heavily on his spirit. Unless he had a compelling reason to remain in Tecapa, Anthony would not exchange his liberty for the toilsome environment of the smelter. Chapter 14. On a vibrant April morning, Anthony finally set out on his journey towards the Amargosa, driving his burros into the lonely desert with determination. He didn't look back, knowing that Tecopa would never forget the name of Wansfell. The monotonous stretches of desert and the rolling bronze hills leading up to the dark mountains beckoned him in a language he felt deep in his bones. If Anthony Fraser, or Wansfell as he now called himself, had any home, it was in the vast openness of the desert under the blazing sun and starry night sky. As he traveled, Anthony noticed the sunrise bursting above the black escarpment to the east, promising a scorching day ahead. The heat had been increasing day by day, and now at sunrise the smoky heat veils were rising from the desert floor. But for Wansfell the hottest weather held no fear, and the warmth of the morning sun felt pleasant against his cheek. After being confined to one place for so long, Anthony relished the feeling of sweat trickling down his body. His muscles loosened, his tension eased, and he felt a surge of strength and endurance. He confidently strode ahead, his burros struggling to keep up with his pace. As he adjusted to the harsh desert environment, his mind shed its morbid and ruthless thoughts, and he felt free and self-sufficient. The desert beckoned him with something strange and thrilling awaiting him beyond the forbidding funeral mountains. He was determined to conquer Death Valley, to experience its mysteries and defy its most fatal dangers. One afternoon, Anthony came across the valley of the Amargosa. It looked bitter, poisonous, and acidic, as suggested by its Spanish name. The narrow stream meandered through the valley, shining like silver in the sunlight. Anthony made his way down into the valley as the sun began to set, casting shadows over the jagged peaks. He stopped at the creek, and the burros drank the unpalatable water with reluctance. Anthony examined the water with interest, knowing that it was necessary for survival in this unforgiving environment. Anthony got to work on his usual camp tasks, which he always found enjoyable. He started by building a fire using dead mesquite wood. After that, he cleaned his oven with sand and applied some grease. He had a large pan that he used for multiple purposes, such as washing dishes and panning for gold. He poured some flour into the pan and mixed it with water to make dough. Suddenly he heard some rustling in the bushes and saw a rabbit hopping by. Fresh meat was a rare opportunity in the desert, so he quickly grabbed his gun and went after the rabbit. He was able to make a clean shot and returned to camp with the rabbit. However, when he got back, he discovered a disaster. Jenny, his burro, had woken up from her nap and found her way to the dishpan. She had eaten all the dough and had it stuck to her nose. Anthony scolded her and tried to catch her, but she was too quick for him. She ran around the camp, eating the dough as she went. Eventually, Anthony caught her, but most of the dough was already gone. He gave her a light punishment, and she went back to sleep. As Anthony sat down to eat his simple meal, the sun began to set, casting a red haze over the valley and turning the distant peaks gold. The heat of the day had subsided, and Anthony walked around in the peaceful twilight. Jenny had given up hope of stealing anything else, so she went to graze somewhere down the stream. There wasn't a sound to be heard, and the infinite silence surrounded the solitude. It was the kind of solitude that only men like Anthony could bear. To him it was both a blessing and a curse. But tonight he felt a powerful sense of oneness with the desert and its elements. As the twilight shadows faded into the blackness of night, the stars shone brightly. Anthony had been feeling the tension release throughout the day, and now in the lonely solitude he felt the weight of his worries and thoughts from Tecapa fall away from him. Loneliness, silence, and time, he murmured to himself as he paced back and forth on the sandy ground. These three things can cure any trouble, any mental illness, any soul-crushing agony. I know this, I'll never forget it. But how different it is now to remember. That must be the secret of the desert's power over men. It's a place of solitude and silence, like the beginning of creation. It's like an eternity of time. Anthony had slowly come to understand the relationship between time and change as his heart began to heal. Memories still stung, but he sensed a change in himself after months of turmoil. The thought of Dismukes brought back the old pain, but it wasn't quite the same. 8 years had passed, and it was hard to believe until he saw physical evidence of the passage of time. Anthony didn't see a clear and peaceful future for himself, but he felt a nameless and divine promise waiting for him. His steps had not led him to hell. He had been pushed across the barren sands of the desert through sandstorms, under the scorching heat and freezing cold, as if he were being whipped by screaming furies. But time had started to dull his pain, fade his past, and change his soul. In that moment he felt uplifted. "I have a mission," he shouted, gazing up at the stars. "Oh, stars so calm and unmerciful, show me how to fulfill my mission as you do yours." He would continue as he had started, battling the desert and its desolation, its scorching heat, its malevolent influences, wandering over these wastelands that were now his home. He would stake his physical strength on even harder, fiercer tasks of labor, pushing his spirit to a more intense, purer flame. If the desert could create invincible energy of strength in a person, he would earn it. If there was a divinity in humans, infinitely beyond the beasts of the desert and the apes of the past, a force in mysterious affinity with that mighty being he sensed out there in the darkness, then he would learn it with a magnified and all-embracing consciousness. Anthony went to bed on the warm sand, complete in two characters, a sensing, watching, listening man like the savage in harmony with the nature of the elements around him, and a feeling, absorbed and meditating priest who had started to understand the secrets beyond the dark-shadowed starlit desert waste. Anthony's first view of Death Valley appeared in the early morning as he turned a last curve in the wide canyon he had descended. He stood in amazement. "Oh, desolation!" he cried. And it appeared that as the shock of the ghastliness beneath him subsided, he recalled with clearness all that had come to him in his long desert wanderings, which now appeared to culminate in this forbidding valley's terrible silence, desolation, death, and decay. The name Death Valley had a dark and ominous origin. Back in 1849, when the gold rush had taken over California, 70 Mormon gold seekers had stumbled into this valley with its red walls and white floors. Unfortunately, 68 of them did not make it out alive. The 2 survivors named the narrow sink, hundreds of feet below sea level, Death Valley. Since then, many more people have died from the unforgiving conditions of this place, such as thirst, heat, wind, cold, and avalanches. The valley was shadowed by the ragged funeral range on one side and the red and gloomy Panamints on the other. The hot stream of Furnace Creek came down from the burning slopes, and Ash Meadow, the valley floor, was gray and dead like the bed of a dead sea. The Devil's Chair, a huge seat worn by the elements in the red mountain wall, was where the Death King of the valley watched over his fiends. These names were vivid in Anthony's mind, along with others given by prospectors in uncouth or eloquent speech, such as She's a Hummer in July, Salty Lid of Hell, and Valley of the White Shadow of Death. Death Valley was over 60 miles long and from 7 to 12 miles wide. No 2 prospectors had ever agreed on these dimensions, but they all agreed on its hellish qualities. Death was the guardian of the valley and the specter that patrolled its beat. Mineral wealth was the irresistible allurement that dared men to defy its terrors. Dismukes himself had claimed there were ledges of gold quartz, and Dismukes was practical and accurate. Many fabulous stories of gold hung on the lips of wandering prospectors. The forbidding red rocks held jewels in their hard confines, garnets, opals, turquoises. There were cliffs of marble and walls of onyx. The valley below was a vast expanse of white, the ground covered in a crust of salt and borax that stretched out for miles. There were beds of other minerals, too, including soda, gypsum, niter, and sulfur. Nature had been generous with her treasures here, but also cruel in her grasp upon them. The few springs and streams that flowed down into the valley were heavily impregnated with minerals, rendering them unpalatable, sour, sulfuric, hot, or even deadly. In the summer, the heat could soar to a scorching 145 degrees, and the winds were withering. Poisonous gases and dust sometimes filled the air, bringing invisible death. In the winter, sudden temperature changes and icy winds could freeze a person to death, and avalanches and cloudbursts were a constant threat. Anthony consulted the map made by Dismukes and set out from the canyon mouth to cross the valley. A long sandy slope dotted with stunted mesquites led down to the flat, wrinkled floor of the valley, which sloped down gradually to a lower level. The burros carrying Anthony's supplies were already showing signs of unease and fatigue, and the going was rough. The sand gave way to a hard crust of salt or borax, and the ground was pockmarked with little dimples and cones that made it hard to find a level footing. Sometimes the crust was solid and unyielding, while other times it cracked and crunched underfoot. The color was a dirty mix of white and yellow, and in the distance Anthony could see a dazzling white plain that looked like frost on a frozen river. Anthony proceeded cautiously behind his burros, which were wary and stepped gingerly on the treacherous ground. It was slow going, but they made progress, one careful step at a time. The scorching sun beat down on Anthony as he trudged through the valley floor. He had experienced hotter days, but this was different. The pressure on his body was like that of the Salton Sink, where he had gone below sea level. It felt like the air around him was closing in, making it harder to breathe. Finally, the burros stopped. Anthony looked up and saw a smooth bed of salt shining like powdered ice. This was the frozen stream he had seen from afar. As he stepped onto the salt, it trembled and heaved beneath his feet. There was no way to tell if the next step would hold him or not, but he trusted his instincts and led Jenny out. She sank a little, but made it across by stepping quickly. Anthony had to drive the other burro, and the salt grew softer as they progressed. In the middle of the glistening stream, it became wet and sticky. The burros struggled through the narrow, low level of the valley. On the other side, a wide flat of salt and mud stretched out, rough and upheaved as if it had boiled and baked to a crust, then cracked and sunk in places. The terrain was treacherous, riddled with holes and obstacles that made it difficult and dangerous to navigate. The ground rose and fell in gnarled hummocks like twisted seashells. Every step was a struggle for the burros, their hooves crunching through the crust and echoing hollowly as if they were about to fall into a vast bottomless pit. Anthony had to be careful not to let the animals stumble or falter, lest they be lost in the unforgiving landscape. As he made his way across the valley, Anthony encountered thin streams of water that burned like acid. He had to find narrow places to cross, leaping carefully to avoid the deadly flow. Eventually, the broken, choppy sea of salt gave way to a sand and gravel plain, a welcome relief after the grueling journey. The heat was almost unbearable, and Anthony could only imagine how much worse it would be in the height of summer. The mountains loomed in the distance, hazy and indistinct. The heat shimmered in waves, distorting any object in the distance. After hours of struggle, Anthony finally reached the base of the Red Mountains. He allowed the burros to rest, taking a long, deep drink of water. His feet ached and his eyes stung from the heat, but he knew he had to press on. Consulting his map, he saw that he needed to travel up the slope and to the west to reach the black buttress of rock that was his goal. With a deep breath, he set out once more into the unforgiving landscape. As Anthony gazed upon the funeral range, he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder. The mountains were a magnificent upheaval of the earth, with the lower Calico Mountains displaying an array of colors that justified their name. Beyond them, the funerals towered, spiked and peaked, ragged as the edge of a saw, piercing the blue sky. It was a gloomy and black zigzagged range of desolation and grandeur. Anthony's gaze then shifted westward to the gulf, a hazy void that seemed to stretch on forever. The valley was vast, with streaked and ridged and canyoned slopes enclosing the abyss into which veils of rain seemed to be dropping. Broken clouds appeared in the west, pierced by gold and red rays, somewhat dulled by the haze. Anthony was amazed to realize that the day was far spent. The scene up the valley of death was confounding. He gazed spellbound, and every second saw more and different aspects. How immense, unreal, weird. He got up from the stone seat that had almost burned through his clothes and bent his steps westward, driving the wearying burros ahead of him. He needed to cover 3 miles toward the black buttressed corner he wanted to gain before dark, so his experienced desert eyes calculated the distance. But this was Death Valley, and no traveler of the desert had ever correctly measured distance in this valley of shadows, hazes, and illusions. He was making 3 miles an hour, yet at the end of an hour he seemed just as far away as ever. Another hour was full of deceits and misjudgments. But at the end of the 3rd hour he reached the black wall, and the line that had seemed a corner was the mouth of a canyon. Anthony halted, as if at the gateway of the unknown. The sun was setting behind the mountains that now overhung him, massive and mighty, a sheer insurmountable world of rock that seemed to reach to the ruddy sky. As the sun began to set, the shadows in the canyon grew longer and deeper, with a purple and blue hue at the bottom and a rosy and gold tint at the top. The sunset haze enveloped the entire area, creating a magnificent view. Anthony had a map of the area which marked the canyon, a spring of water just beyond it, and the shack where a peculiar man and woman lived under the slant of weathered rock. Despite his curiosity, Anthony decided not to attempt finding the location that night and instead settled for a dry camp. As darkness approached, he felt exhausted and burdened. The day had seemed short, but the journey was long. When he lay down in his bed, he couldn't help but notice the striking dissimilarity of this place to any other he had experienced in the desert. The silence was profound, and it felt as though no sound had ever penetrated it. The darkness was overwhelming, with black walls rising up to a sky filled with stars as blue as indigo. The valley seemed to be alive, breathing invisibly and silently. There was a mighty being awake out there in the black void. Anthony couldn't believe that any man or woman lived in such a place, and he wondered if Dismukes had merely dreamed it up. He had heard from many prospectors that no white woman could live in Death Valley, and even though he had only been there a day, he understood why. It wasn't just the heat, poison, wind, and natural disasters that made it impossible for women to survive. It was the alternations of terror and sublimity, beauty and horror. The feminine part of Anthony shuddered at the thought of such solitude, which seemed fitting to a world that had been burned out. He felt like the last of his race at the end of its existence, with even the strongest finally brought to his doom. Tomorrow the earth would be sterile. These thoughts weighed heavily on Anthony's mind as he drifted off to sleep. The next morning he awoke later than usual and saw the sun rising over the funeral range. The sun was a coalescing globule of molten fire, enormous and red, surrounded by a sky-broad yellow flare. The sunrise was different than any other that Anthony had ever seen. It felt closer to him and to the earth. The valley was empty and still, making everything look small and far away. After breakfast, Anthony set out to find his burrows. He found them in a high-walled opening that didn't look like a canyon, but instead like a space created by two mountain slopes that ran down to a wash where water flowed during certain seasons. Beyond the corners of the opening was a field that seemed to widen and slope gradually. It was gray with rocks and sand and had stunted brush growing in it. A line of gnarled mesquites followed the course of the wash through the center of the field. Jenny, one of Anthony's burros, was asleep as usual, and Jack was contentedly grazing. Suddenly a rock rolled down a rough slope, and Anthony was thrilled by the sound. He remembered what Dismukes had said about the dangerous location of the shack where a man and woman lived under the shadow of a weathering mountain. Anthony turned to look across the space in the direction where the sound had come from and saw a mighty mountain slope that was completely devoid of plants. It was a gray, drab ascent of rocks with a million facets. Anthony strode toward it, gradually getting higher and nearer through the rock-strewn field. It looked so close that it seemed magnified, but it was actually a good distance away. Eventually he saw a rude shack and halted. He couldn't believe that this could be what he was searching for. It was not what he had expected. The place was not even a quarter of a mile away from Death Valley and was below sea level. The crude, small structure looked like it had been built and abandoned by some prospector. However, any prospector could have built a better abode than this. Anthony walked on, growing more curious and doubtful. Only a fool or a knave would have chosen such a perilous spot. The ground began to slope and was bare of brush. Large boulders dotted the area, giving the impression that they had recently tumbled down. Anthony saw no signs of smoke, life, or labor, which only heightened his doubts about anyone living there. But then he spotted a deep footprint in the sand, made only the day before. Anthony knelt to study it and rose with certainty. Dismukes had been correct about the direction, if not the distance. Anthony surveyed the area beyond the shack and saw a patch of green mesquite trees and grassy mounds. There was the water Dismukes had mentioned. Looking up, Anthony saw a broad belt of enormous boulders, the edge of a talus at the base of a mountainside. The rocks had both smooth and sharp surfaces, and the belt was steep and fan-shaped, spreading out at the bottom and growing steeper as it rose. It was like an avalanche, sliding inch by inch and foot by foot. The base of the fan extended for miles and led up to a massive mountain abutment, dull red in color and so seamed and cracked that it looked like a net of rocks pieced together by some colossal hand. Despite its rugged appearance, the mountain wall shone in the sunlight and looked like it had been shattered by some natural cataclysm. Above the jagged ruins, a slope of broken rocks hung perilously, each heap of stones appearing as though it was about to roll down. The red mountain had been disintegrated by both frost and heat, leaving behind a history of age that was written in every crevice. Though the sun shone on the millions of facets, no beauty could be found in the sinister, dull hue of red. The mountain loomed dark and terrible even in the broad daylight with its unstable, forbidding rocks. It was a wonder what held the seamed and lined mass of rock together, and what it was waiting for. Only time and the law of the desert knew. As Anthony gazed at the mountain, a weathered fragment broke away from the heights and rolled off the upper wall, cracking ringingly as it hit the lower slope and eventually coming to a stop with a little hollow report. This was the story of the mountain. It was in motion, working down to a level by atom and by mass. Boulders twice the size of the shack had already rolled down the field. At any moment, another rock might topple off the rampart and come hurtling down towards the shack. Someday, the whole slope of loose rock, standing almost on end, would slide down in an avalanche. "Well," muttered Anthony darkly, "any man who made a woman live there was either crazy or meant her to have an awful death." Anthony strode towards the shack, which offered shelter from the sun but not from the rain or dust. Pack saddles and boxes were stacked on one side, while empty cans were scattered everywhere. A pile of recently cut mesquite stood in front of the aperture that was the door. On the sand lay blackened stones and utensils near the remains of a still smoldering fire. "Hello inside," called Anthony as he halted at the door, but no sound answered. As he stooped to peer inside, Anthony saw a crude room with a sand floor, a rickety table made of wooden boards, and flat stones serving as seats. The shelves were cluttered with tins and bags, and utensils and dishes were strewn about. A flimsy partition of poles and canvas separated this room from a larger one. Anthony spied a narrow bed of blankets raised on poles, an old valise on the sandy floor, and women's clothing hanging on the brush walls. He called out louder this time and caught a flash of gray through the torn canvas, followed by a low cry of a woman's voice. Anthony stepped back, and the voice cried out, "Elliot, you've come back!" Anthony replied, "No, it's a stranger." The woman hurriedly approached, a figure of noble proportions but with a frail frame. Her face was white, and her eyes were large and deep, strained and sad. "Who are you?" she asked. "Ma'am, my name is Wansfell. I'm a friend of Dismukes, the prospector who was here. I'm crossing Death Valley and thought I'd call on you." "Dismukes? The little miner who was huge like a frog?" she replied, with eyes widening. "I remember. He was kind, but— And you're his friend?" "Yes, at your service, ma'am." "Thank God," she cried brokenly and leaned against the door. "I'm in trouble. I've been alone all night. My husband left yesterday with only a canteen. He said he'd be back for supper, but he didn't come. Oh, something has happened to him." "Many things happen in the desert," said Anthony. "I'll find your husband. I saw his tracks out here in the sand." "Oh, can you find him?" "Ma'am, I can track a rabbit to its burrow. Don't worry any more." "I will track your husband and find him." The woman suddenly seemed to be struck with Anthony's tone or his appearance. At first she seemed to pay him no mind. "He once got lost and was gone for 2 days. Another time he was overcome by the heat or something in the air," she said. "Have you been alone before?" Anthony asked, sensing the pain in her voice. "Alone? Many, many lonely nights," she replied. "He's left me alone often, purposely for me to torture my soul here in the blackness. And those rolling rocks cracking in the dead of night?" Her voice trailed off, as if she had revealed too much to a stranger. "Ma'am, is your husband in his right mind?" Anthony asked. She hesitated, wanting him to think her husband irrational, but unable to say so truthfully. "Men do strange things in the desert," Anthony offered. "May I ask, ma'am, do you have food and water?" "Yes, we have plenty, but Elliot makes me cook, and I never learned how. So we've fared poorly, but he eats little and I less." "Will you tell me how he came to build your hut here, where sooner or later it'll be crushed by rolling stones?" Anthony asked. A tragic shadow crossed her beautiful dark blue eyes. This place was near the water. He cut the brush here. He didn't see. Wouldn't believe the danger," she faltered, lying poorly. Her delicate lips, curved and soft, seemed too fine for falsehood. "Perhaps I can make him see," Anthony offered. "I'll go find him. He's probably lost. The heat isn't strong enough to be dangerous, and he hasn't been gone long. Don't worry. My camp is just below. I'll fetch him back today or tomorrow at the farthest." She murmured some incoherent thanks, her penetrating gaze still fixed on him even in her distress. With his head bowed, he strode away, scanning the sand for the man's tracks. Soon he spotted them, leading down towards the valley. For Anthony, following such an obvious trail was easy, thanks to his desert-trained sight that had saved his life countless times. He was as sharp as a wolf on the scent, able to track lizards to their holes and snakes to their rocks, either to eat or die trying. The man's tracks led straight down to the open valley along the western slope to a dry water hole. From there they went down to the edge of a wide bench, beneath which the white crust began its level monotony towards the other side of the valley. This place was different from where Anthony had crossed miles below. It was lower, and the bowl's bottom made it difficult for him to breathe. He experienced sensations like intermittent rushes of blood to his head, and the leaden air weighed him down. Although he could not detect any odor, he knew that there was some kind of impurity in the stagnant air. It reminded him that he was in Death Valley. He paused for a moment, considering his options. If the man's tracks continued across the valley, he would return to camp for a canteen and then continue the chase. However, the tracks veered off to the west, meandering aimlessly. Anthony's stride was 3 times that of the man's, and he was not bothered by the heat. However, that faint smell of gas was cause for concern. For miles he followed the meandering tracks westward until he came to a ridge that, according to Dismuke's map, separated Death Valley from its neighbor, Lost Valley. On the left side of the ridge, the tracks wandered up the slope to the base of the mountain, following it in wide scallops. The footprints now showed the dragging of boots, and little by little they appeared fresher in the sand. The weary traveler had not stopped to rest throughout the night. The trail he left behind was getting deeper and more erratic. It seemed like he was struggling, swaying back and forth. Anthony noticed the marks where the man had fallen, the imprints of his hands, and a smooth furrow in the sand where he had dragged his canteen. Then the signs where he had fallen again and started crawling. "Looks like the same old story," Anthony muttered to himself. "I'll probably find him dying or already dead. It's better that way for his wife. I wonder. Anthony had spent a year wandering, leading him far from civilization, down lonely desert roads where only a few brave souls like himself dared to venture. Despite the harsh conditions, he had developed a sense of something inexplicable, feeling the pulse of the desert, hearing the mournful music that echoed across the barren expanse. Even in the lifeless wastelands, he felt a connection to humanity. He squinted through the hot sun, scanning the horizon until he noticed movement. At first he thought it was a massive land turtle, but as he drew closer he saw it was a man crawling on his hands and knees. Chapter 15. With the strides of a giant, Anthony charged forward until he came across a ragged and dirty man slowly crawling through the sand while dragging a canteen. "Hey, stop!" shouted Anthony loudly. The man came to a halt but didn't lift his head. Anthony leaned down to take a closer look at him. "What's wrong with you?" asked Anthony sharply. "Huh," grunted the man stupidly. Anthony tried again, shaking the man as he repeated his question. However, the man only grunted in response. Anthony lifted the man up and supported him, leading him across the sand. The man's balance had been thrown off, and like many men in the desert, he wanted to wander off course. Anthony persisted, but holding on to the man was becoming more difficult than just carrying him. Eventually, Anthony let go of the man out of curiosity to see what he would do, and he stumbled around in a circle like a dazed animal. Despite his disheveled appearance, the man's clothing and overall appearance indicated that he was not a common sight in the desert. The sun was scorching, and Anthony knew they were miles away from their camp and wouldn't make it at this rate. He had to think of a plan. Without hesitation, he picked up the man and threw him over his shoulder. The man's weight was no match for Anthony's strength, but his constant squirming made it difficult for Anthony to walk steadily. "You poor thing," Anthony muttered to himself, finally coming to a halt. "Maybe I can't save your life, but I've got to try." With that, he laid the man down and delivered a powerful blow to his head, rendering him unconscious. It was then easy for Anthony to lift him and carry him like an empty sack. The weight of the man and the hot sun made the task more and more difficult, and Anthony was forced to take frequent breaks to catch his breath and regain his strength. Despite the obstacles, Anthony carried on, determined to save the man's life. He walked slower, rested more often, and began to feel the weight of the man's body more acutely. As the hours passed, the sun disappeared beyond the red iron mountain wall, and purple shadows crept into the valley. The landscape was painted a deep red as Anthony reached the more level field, where large boulders were scattered about. His nerves felt like a million needles were stinging them, and spears of light pierced his darkened sight. The only limit to his endurance was reaching the shack, and when he finally did, the woman's poignant call rang in his throbbing ears. Through the ruddy haze, he saw her as a white shape. Depositing his burden on the sand, the woman moaned, "Oh, he's dead!" Pity, fear, and even terror were present in her cry, but not love. "Ah, you've saved him, then." "He's injured, there's a great bruise, he breathes so heavily," she said, as Anthony sat panting and unable to speak. The woman wiped her husband's face and worked over him. "He came back once and fell into a stupor like this, but not so deep." "What can it be?" she asked. "Poison air," choked Anthony. "Oh, this terrible Death Valley!" the woman cried. Anthony's sight cleared, and he saw the woman, who was dressed in a white robe over her gray dress. The garment was clean and rich, and it fell in thick folds, strange to Anthony's sight, recalling the past. The afterglow of sunset shone down into the valley, lighting her face. Once she must have been beautiful. The perfect lines, the noble brow, and the curved lips were still there, but her face was thin, strained, and tragic. Only her eyes held beauty. "You saved him?" she asked with quick-drawn breath. "Found him miles and miles up the valley, crawling on his hands and knees," panted Anthony. "I had to carry him." "You carried him?" she exclaimed incredulously. Then her large eyes blazed. "So that's why you were so livid while you fell? Oh, you splendid man, you giant! He'd have died out there alone." Magdalene Veery reached out her hand and touched Anthony's with a grateful expression on her face. "I thank you from the bottom of my heart," she said. Anthony immediately sprang into action. "Get some water and bathe him," he instructed. "Do you have any ammonia or whiskey?" The woman hurried into the shack and returned with a basin, towel, and a small black satchel filled with medicine. Together they worked to revive her husband, but despite their efforts he remained unconscious. "Help me carry him inside," Anthony said. The shack was nearly pitch black, and he asked if she had a light. "No," she replied. "I'll fetch a candle. You stay with him while I move my camp up here. If he has another shirt, you might want to change him. I'll be back soon, and we can have some supper together." After Anthony had finished unpacking, he lit a candle and brought it to the door. Magdalene emerged from the darkness, her white clothing shimmering like a ghost and her eyes shining like stars. She took the candle from him, and their hands touched briefly. "Thank you," she said. "Please don't call me ma'am. My name is Magdalene Veery." Anthony asked about her husband, but she said he was still unconscious. Inside the shack, Anthony realized that it was too small for him, and Magdalene commented on his height. With the dim light of a flickering candle, Anthony could barely make out the features of the man whose life he had saved. The man's face resembled that of a restrained Lucifer, his past life ruined and his heart broken. "He's sleeping," Anthony declared. "Not in a trance or stupor, just worn out. It might be best not to wake him." "Do you really think so?" the woman asked with a sigh of relief. "I'm not sure. Maybe if we watch him for a while we'll know. I'll go get us some supper and call you when it's ready," she offered. Anthony, who was usually adept at camp tasks, found himself struggling this evening. However, he managed to prepare a meal and threw some brush on the fire to provide more light. "Mrs. Veery," he called out to the woman, "come and eat now." He couldn't help but admire the woman's tall, slender figure draped in a white gown. She possessed the poise of a proud and aloof woman, yet her sad face resembled that of a Madonna. It was a strange sight to see such a woman sitting at his campfire in Death Valley. The darkness of the night concealed the ravages that had marred her beauty during the day. Anthony offered her a canvas pack to sit on and served her with a sense of satisfaction he couldn't quite explain. As a desert dweller, he could recognize the signs of starvation, and it was clear to him that this woman was half-starved. Watching her eat brought back memories of his own days of hunger. Despite her exquisitely spiritual face, self-preservation was still her first instinct. "I've never eaten so heartily," she exclaimed, finally satiated. "But it all tasted so good." "You're a damn good cook," the woman said, impressed by the meal Anthony had prepared for her. "Thanks," replied Anthony, feeling proud. "I don't always have the chance to show off my skills like this." "Why not?" she asked, curious. "Well, I don't often have the pleasure of serving a woman," Anthony admitted. The woman leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees and staring at him with intense interest. Her eyes were large and bright, shining in the darkness. Anthony sensed that she had never really looked at him before and that something about him had caught her attention. "It was that miner, she began. "Dismukes," Anthony corrected her. "Yes, he sent me here. Are you a miner too?" "No," she replied. "I don't care much for gold." "Ah, I see. So what brings you to this desert?" "I'm just a wanderer," she said. "They call me Wansfell, the Wanderer." "They? Who are they?" "Well, I suppose they're other wanderers, people who roam the desert seeking gold or peace or solitude, people who are driven or who hide. There aren't many of us, but over time we seem to multiply." "I've seen my share of desert wanderers," the woman said, her gaze fixed on Anthony. "But none like you. Why did you come here?" "Years ago my life was ruined," Anthony said slowly. "I chose to fight the desert, and the thing that helped me most was not to pass by anyone in trouble. The desert is a harsh and unforgiving place. Life is stripped bare here like those stark mountainsides. Dismukes is my friend. He saved me from death once. He knows this wasteland better than anyone. He told me about you being here. He said no white woman could survive in Death Valley. I wondered if I could at least advise you, turn you back. So I came." The woman was moved by Anthony's sincerity, and she felt a glimmer of hope. "Your words are a comfort, sir," she said. "But I can't go back now. It's too late." "Never too late," replied Anthony. "I won't pressure you, Mrs. Veery. I understand the value of peace, but it's dangerous for a woman of your quality to be here. This is Death Valley in April, soon to be May, then June. It's impossible for you to survive the summer. I don't know why you're here, and I won't ask. But you can't stay.